Sango, I'm Dale Montour. We have an act in this country called the Canadian Human Rights Act. Its purpose is to ensure that all Canadians, regardless of race, religion, or sex, have equality of opportunity. Max Yalden, chairman of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, stated in his last report that the #1 human rights problem in this country are the neglected rights of Aboriginal peoples. On today's show, we'll speak to Max Yalden about his report. We'll ask Tom Siddon, current Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, what he thinks about that report and what he is doing to prevent the continued human rights violations against Aboriginal peoples. And we'll visit the Inuit of the far north. We'll learn about human rights abuses committed against these people that are a national shame. Mr. Yalden, can you explain to us why the Commission was formed and what its mandate is?
Well, the Canadian Human Rights Act was passed in 1977, and I believe the Commission came into existence in 1978. The Canadian Human Rights Act says that all Canadians, and I underline all, should have equality of opportunity and should not be impeded from having the kind of full life in Canada that they're entitled to because of their race or their religion or their sex or their age or whether they're handicapped or what have you. There are 10 specific types of discrimination which are forbidden by the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, the purpose of the Commission is to ensure that that act is respected, and we do so by taking complaints and dealing with those complaints and trying to resolve them, and we also do so by trying to work as vigorously as we can in general terms for human rights in this country, and of course I include the rights of Aboriginal peoples.
In your 1990 annual report, you mentioned that the #1 human rights problem in this country is Aboriginal rights. Why did you make that statement?
Well, I think it's true from every point of view in terms of all the indicators you can think of, whether it be age of death or fatalities at birth or alcoholism or social problems or income or unemployment. Whatever you consider, you will find that the Native peoples are at the bottom of the heap. Now, part of that is a direct result, I think, of discrimination. There's no doubt that people who look at Canada from outside, from abroad, when they see what is otherwise a reasonable, decent, and apparently tolerant country, are puzzled by the treatment that's been afforded to Aboriginal peoples over the decades and indeed over the centuries. So that the range of reasons for that statement that we made in our annual report is very great indeed.
This is not news to us. As a matter of fact, for a lot of Aboriginal people, they might as well be living in the third world. I also spoke to the current Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs, Tom Siddon, about Mr. Yalden's report. Was he of the same mind? If so, why was he so critical of it? Very recently, the Canadian Human Rights Commission issued its report. Max Yalden, who is the chairman, said that the #1 human rights problem in this country are the neglected rights of Aboriginal peoples. What is your response to that report?
Well, I think it's obvious to all Canadians that there's a certainly a lower level of opportunity and living conditions, and human problems are much more serious and challenging within Native communities and on Indian reserves than in the general society. So that there is obvious evidence that the way in which our relationship has evolved over the last many decades has not produced the solution to the problem of social equity and justice for Aboriginal people. So that in that sense, I think it's a valid observation.
But your first response to the initial report was very critical.
Well, first of all, the final version of his report from 1990 was released this spring, and it was much more moderate in tone than an interim study that they released last autumn, which was the one I reacted to. And what I said was that the analysis was oversimplified, and that I was disappointed that Mr. Yalden and his researchers had not consulted with the Department of Indian Affairs to find out the other side, some of the concerns that were being expressed. The fact is, among the nations of the world with significant populations of Aboriginal people, the government of Canada has been the most progressive in terms of the programs available and the assistance devoted, financial and otherwise, to advancing the cause of Aboriginal people. The very existence in our Constitution of the recognition of Aboriginal rights And the strong advocacy of Canada at the United Nations and in other international fora on behalf of Aboriginal people is evidence of our commitment.
Mr. Yalden, when you issued your statement last November, the Minister of Indian Affairs, Tom Siddon, was very critical of that report. He said also at that time that a lot of progress had been made and perhaps that you didn't see that.
Well, we didn't at any point deny the progress that's been made. I'm afraid I can't take account of all the sensitivities of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. We said repeatedly that, of course, we knew that progress had been made. We said that we knew that Native peoples were better off than they had been. The trouble is they had been so badly off that even though they were better off, they still weren't as well off as they should be, or as other Canadians were, or as all Canadians have a right to think they should be. And these were the kind of points we were making, and that happens to be the simple truth, and I'm afraid that we can't do anything about it if it makes one or two people in Ottawa unhappy.
Before my interview with Mr. Yalden, I read the Human Rights Act. I found out that nothing in the Act affects any provision of the Indian Act. Since the Indian Act has been a discriminatory and still is a paternalistic document governing our whole lives, wouldn't it make sense to take this clause out of the Human Rights Act? Of course, I asked them both what they...
You're right that the Canadian Human Rights Act contains a clause that in this act will affect actions taken under the Indian Act. That was put in, and remind you now, that was put in 15 years ago. This is ancient history, because people were worried about what an active commission interested in human rights might do, and they wanted to sort of put a blocker in there. I have, since I've been head of this commission, lobbied as vigorously as I can to get that clause out of there, and I hope they do take it out of there. I find it ridiculous that somehow or other a Human Rights Act should apply to everything going on in this country except the major human rights problem in this country, and I would like it removed.
And in fact, we are the first country, and if I'm correct, the only country in the world that recognizes those special rights of our Indigenous people in our Constitution. And that may be why, in some respects, those special rights have been exempted from the application of the Canadian Human Rights Act. So it's not simply a matter of removing something, but if Mr. Yalden, as Canada's #1 human rights expert, believes this should be considered, it's certainly something that I would seriously look at. But I'd like to hear from First Nations leadership. Do they feel there's some special protection there in that exemption? Or are they willing to see it removed?
If you have been listening, Mr. Siddon, our people believe, and Mr. Yalden made the recommendation in his report, that the Indian Act should be abolished. Even you are aware of its many shortcomings.
The problem has been that under the Indian Act and under the paternalistic relationship where we, the Europeans, came and said to the First Nations, we know better. We can tell you how to sort your lives out. We can help you to be raised above this circumstance in which you've lived for centuries. We were wrong. And it has failed. So we can spend all the money we like. We can have all the politicians making all the great speeches we like, and it's not going to solve the problem. We have to listen.
The government said it was the promised land. All the Inuit found was a cold desert.
I guess the Inuit are known for their resourcefulness, and we survive by our wits. No other way.
Next, on Aboriginal Voices. Years old, you have your family, your friends, a roof over your head, and enough food to fill your belly. Then suddenly, these strange people in uniform appear. Your mother tells you that they're going to take you to the Promised Land, a place where there will be even more food to eat, where the weather is beautiful all the time, and where everyone will be happy. 3 weeks from the start of your boat trip and 3,000 miles later, you find that the Promised Land is nothing but cold, gray, barren rock. This, you say to yourself, is not happiness. That young boy is now a man, and his name is John Amagolik. John's family was one of 15 families that were relocated to the high Arctic from northern Quebec between the years 1953 and 1957. They left from what is present-day Inukjuak all the way up to Craig Harbor and Resolute Bay. The families agreed to go because they were told that this was a land of plenty, that wildlife would be more abundant, and that there would be better economic opportunities.
When the RCMP were trying to persuade us to move, they gave us a glowing description of where we were going. They described it in terms of the promised land, a land of plenty, lots of animals, opportunities for employment, a better life. So they described it in very glowing terms. But when we got there, it was completely the opposite. It was like landing on the moon. I mean, when we landed on the beach, when we were dumped on the beach, it was just gray as far as the eye could see. There was no vegetation, just gravel as far as the eye could see. Not a living thing in sight. And as time went by, we also found that the plenty that they were talking about didn't exist. In northern Quebec, we were used to living off the land where we could harvest something like 51 or 52 different species of plants and animals for our survival. Up there, the number of species that we could harvest was down to 7. So the government told us complete lies. The animals were fewer, and there was no vegetation, almost no birds. And in northern Quebec, we were used to a diet of plants and fish and small game birds. Up there, none of that existed, and our diet had to change from that to that of polar bears, seals, and walrus. So it was very different. The climate was much more harsh, and what made it worse was that we found out in November that the sun went down in November and didn't come back until February. So we had this 3 months of total darkness, which was devastating to us.
They also agreed to go because the RCMP promised that the families would not be split up. At Pond Inlet, the families were divided. John's family went to Resolute Bay, and others went to Craig Harbor, which is now present-day Grise Fjord. Another promise broken.
I was almost 6, but I do remember that moment very clearly because when he came to us and told us that we would have to be split, of course, my parents and all the adults started protesting very loudly, and the protest didn't do any good. The RCMP told us, you know, the government has decided to do this, and you pretty much have no choice. And when that was made clear to us, the women started to cry. We were all on the front deck of the ship, and the women started to cry. And we had 60 or 70 dogs with us, and they all joined in, so the women were crying, the dogs were howling. It was a pretty terrifying experience for a little kid like myself.
A third promise made by the RCMP was that if the Inuit couldn't adjust properly, they would be returned to their original homeland after 2 years. Most of the families have returned, but they were not moved back until the 1980s, some 30 years after they were moved in the first place. For all those broken promises and all that they have suffered, these Inuit are fighting back. John was one of those who gave testimony on March 19, 1990, before the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs. Their testimony, along with written evidence, claimed that the federal government relocated these families primarily out of concern for the protection of Canadian sovereignty, and not because of better economic opportunities. In fact, they said that game was often short in supply and that they were often hungry.
Well, I suppose Canadians in this day and age find it hard to believe, but back in the 50s, this was reality. And, I mean, the government, I think, at that time considered us as something less than human beings. And they lied to us. They sent us to a place where there were no health facilities. We couldn't pursue our education. We were completely cut off from the rest of the world. The RCMP officer who was looking after us was our only link to the outside world. There was no transportation, no mail, no radio, nothing. We were completely cut off. And for the first 2 years, we had to depend a lot on the white man's dump for our food, our clothing, and the little houses that we managed to build. all this came from the white man's dump.
After reviewing the information, the Standing Committee made 5 recommendations which would require the government to acknowledge the role played by the Inuit relocated to the high Arctic in the protection of Canadian sovereignty in the North, make an apology for the wrongdoing which the government inflicted on the people of Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay, carry out such an apology with due solemnity, accompany the apology with some form of recognition of the contribution to Canadian sovereignty made by the Inuit people of Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay, and consider compensation to the people of Grise Fiord and Resolute Bay for their service to Canada and the wrongdoing inflicted upon them. Coming up, the response of the Canadian government to the Standing Committee's recommendations and the resulting Inuit outrage.
Well, I really can't understand why the government is denying responsibility, because they are clearly responsible for this.
Next, the government had 150 days to respond to the committee's report.
Well,
it responded with the Hickling report, tabled in the House of Commons on behalf of Tom Siddon. With the tabling of this report, the minister chose not to address the findings and recommendations of the House Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs.
Well, I personally couldn't believe what I saw. I couldn't believe that the consultant report would come out with these findings. I just couldn't believe it. They depended a lot on government employees who were not there. They depended a lot on testimony from people who didn't arrive in Resolute until much later. And they dismissed testimony by living people, people who were actually there, the people who actually appeared before the committee, and they gave their testimony, and the Department of Indian Affairs chose not to believe this, and instead they are hiding behind this Hickling report, which they paid for, and I'm sure they had an influence in the final findings. So I think there's a cover-up. I don't think there's any doubt that there is some sort of cover-up, and that the Department of Indian Affairs is using Hickling as a shield to hide behind.
I know of John Emagolik's assertions, his recollections as a very young boy. I think he was 4 or 5 years of age, and it must have been quite an astonishing experience and quite traumatic if you came from the upper reaches of northern Quebec. Perhaps you were familiar with trees and not surrounded by the barren Arctic ice flows, and then to be located there must have been something that left a profound effect on him. But we did the studies. In fact, the consultant's report, which was completed last winter, which I tabled in Parliament, clearly indicates that there was valid economic reason for the relocation, and there's evidence of that. There were also allegations of mistreatment, which are being investigated, I understand, through a separate process, through the RCM police, and their report is not yet in. But in terms of the basic reasons for the relocation and any hardship which was faced, in fact, I'm told that the hunting success and the ability to provide adequate and abundant food supply for those families that moved was indeed much greater than it had been in northern Quebec, that there was a positive benefit once they adjusted to the obvious change of surroundings, which would be, I'm sure, traumatic.
The Canadian Inuit are asking for an apology because they feel they have suffered greatly. Why won't the government of Canada apologize?
At every time in history, decisions are taken by people who are in positions of responsibility or authority. Some of those decisions are good and some are not so good. I don't think there's much to be accomplished by looking backward and being vindictive. We're all part of the society in which we live. We are all part of the problems we confront, and we all have to pitch in and work together to find the solutions. And I just don't think it's productive to keep looking in the rearview mirror when we have so many important social challenges.
Well, I really can't understand why the government is denying responsibility, because they are clearly responsible for this. And it was their project. They made promises to us, which they broke. We suffered human rights violations as a result of government policy. After all, these people who were the RCMP and the people working for the government committed some of these human rights violations. So the government is clearly responsible, and I cannot understand why they keep denying this.
John Amagwalik and Makavik Corporation, a body representing the Inuit of Quebec, sent a letter to the Prime Minister on November 30th, 1990, expressing their outrage at the Hickling Report. On March 21st, 1991, Tom Siddon responded on behalf of the Prime Minister, reiterating his belief in the Hickling Report. Amagwalik and Makavik's latest response was sent on May 6, 1991, again seeking apology, recognition, and compensation for the relocation. We spoke to Tom Siddon on June 20th, 1991, 6 weeks after their last letter. So where does it go from here? These are serious human rights allegations, and the Inuit aren't going to rest until they feel justice is done. Another report, but this time carried out by the Human Rights Commission itself.
We are trying to get the agreement of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs and of the Mr. Amagwalik and the Inuit people who were involved to have a scholar take another look at the file and take another look at the documentary evidence and try to talk to some of the people and to see if we can't go a little bit further towards reaching an agreed version of the truth, as it were, because you'll recall that Indian and Northern Affairs did a study which in effect said there was nothing had gone wrong and that this was largely imaginary, and the Inuit people said that this was absolute nonsense and quite unacceptable, and that's where we stand today. We are also in contact with the Parliamentary Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, Mr. Hughes's committee, and we're trying to make sure that they will endorse whatever study we have done. Essentially, all we're doing now, we have a person in mind. We're trying to make sure that that person is acceptable to both sides, because I don't want to see repeated what happened the last time. A study is done, and the Inuit said they weren't consulted about it, and the department said, oh yes, we consulted them, and it's the usual, one says black and the other says white, and you don't have any meeting of minds, and it serves no purpose whatever.
Thank you for joining us. For Alan Deliri, I'm Dale Montour. Onigiwahi, Sego Dedese.